Sometime in the 1920s, a Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Mejia Cespe was walking the foothills above the Rio Grande de Nazca on the southern coast of Peru, doing the least glamorous work his profession had to offer. He was tracing irrigation channels, old ones. He was looking down at the ground, at the way water had once been moved across a desert that receives almost no rain, and on the slopes around him he found lines. Long, shallow furrows cut into the surface stone, running away over the rise, too straight to be animal tracks and too shallow to be roads. He followed them, he wrote them up, he called them Sikhs, sacred ways, and he presented them in Lima in 1939 at the 27th International Congress of Americanists. The paper appeared in the proceedings the following year, filed under a title about aqueducts and ancient roads. Nothing happened. Not because he was wrong, because he was early, and because he was standing on the ground. Everything about the Nazca lines that has ever changed our minds has arrived the same way. Not as a discovery, as an instrument. Someone acquires a new way of looking, and the desert, which has not moved, has not eroded away, has not been buried under anything, begins saying something it was not saying the week before. We are going to walk that century in order, through 5 instruments: an aircraft, a tape measure, a pair of boots, 6 people with sticks and string in a Kentucky landfill, and finally a machine, trained on a few hundred examples that in one field season found 303 drawings a century of archaeologists had walked straight past. The desert never hid anything. We simply could not read it. Number 5. The aircraft. On the June 2nd of June, 1941, the day after the southern winter solstice, an American historian named Paul Kosak was standing at the end of one of those lines in the late afternoon. Kosak had come to Peru from Long Island University to study ancient irrigation, the same subject that had brought Mejia Cespe to the same desert 15 years earlier. He had spent the day on the Pampa. He looked up from his work, and the sun went down directly along the line he had been standing on. He drew the obvious conclusion, and he drew it fast. He called the Pampa the largest astronomy book in the world. That phrase did more to shape the next 50 years of Nazca research than any excavation. Kosak published the reading in 1947 in the magazine Natural History, in a paper called The Markings of Nazca, written in collaboration with a German mathematician he had recently brought out to the desert with him. Her name was Maria Ricci, and we will come back to her. But before the sunset, understand why anyone was in the air at all. The Nazca Pampa is a tableland about 50 kilometers inland from the Peruvian coast, roughly 500 meters above the sea. And it is one of the driest surfaces on the planet. That is the whole reason there is anything to look at. The geoglyphs are not carved and they are not painted. They are made by moving stones. The desert surface is covered in a dark, oxidized gravel. Lift that gravel aside and the pale ground underneath shows through pile the removed stones along the edge, and you get a third tone, darker still. 3 shades, no pigment, no tools beyond hands and a basket. A drawing made that way should have lasted about a decade anywhere else on Earth. It has lasted 2,000 years here because this ground does not flood and cannot be farmed. Nobody plowed it, nobody built on it. The Pampa survived by being useless. Then, in the 1930s, aircraft began crossing it, surveying for water from up there. The largest figures were unmistakable. Field survey backed by aerial photography produced the first real inventory. 112 figurative geoglyphs across the Pampa and the country around it. 39 of them were the enormous line-type figures, the hummingbird and the monkey and the spider, the ones on every poster ever printed about this place. 73 were something else. Smaller, fainter, sitting on slopes rather than on the flat. Nobody paid much attention to the 73. We are going to need them later, and we should be exact about what happened on the 22nd of June, 1941, because it is a much smaller event than it sounds. 1 man, 1 line, 1 sunset, 1 evening. A hypothesis about an entire desert was built on a sample of 1, and the honest thing to say is that it stood for decades, not because it had been tested, but because nobody yet had any way to test it. Kosak left Peru within a few years. The person he handed the Pampa to stayed for 55. Number 4. The tape measure. Maria Ricci was a German-born mathematician who had come to Peru in the 1930s and never really left, from 1941 until her death in 1998. She measured the Nazca lines by hand. She swept them clear with a broom. She went through so many brooms that, by her own account, rumors went around that she might be a witch. She slept out on the Pampa. She spent decades fighting, largely alone, to keep vehicles off it. And what we have from those 55 years is not a theory. It is an inventory of technique. Reich found that the Nazca artists had worked from preliminary drawings laid out on small plots roughly 6 feet square, and that those plots are still sitting on the ground beside many of the larger figures. She showed that a straight line could be pulled by stretching a rope between two stakes, that a circle could be scribed with a rope anchored to a stone, that complex curves could be assembled by linking arcs, and the detail that convinced people that there really are stones and post holes lying exactly where the centers of those arcs would have to be. She extracted a recurring unit of measurement from the figures themselves, a little over 12.5 inches. Read that list again as what it is. Rope stakes, a working plan drawn small, a standard unit. That is not a mystery. That is a construction method recovered piece by piece by a woman on her knees in gravel, which makes one line in her own book difficult to read. Now, ancient Peruvians, she wrote, must have had instruments and equipment which we ignore, and which together with ancient knowledge were buried and hidden from the eyes of the conquerors. She was holding the instruments, she had found all 3 of them herself. Here's where we have to be honest about the astronomy she spent her life defending. In the late 1960s, the astronomer Gerald Hawkins ran the orientations of the lines through a computer, in work supported by the National Geographic Society, testing them against the positions of the sun, the moon, and the stars as they stood 2,000 years ago. William Isbell, writing in Scientific American in 1978, summarized the outcome as carefully as it deserves. The analysis failed to demonstrate that a majority of the lines have astronomical significance, although roughly twice as many as chance would predict did line up with the annual extremes of the sun and the moon. That is not nothing. It is also not a calendar. A careful viewer should hold the sky reading loosely, and should notice the shape of what happened, because it is going to happen again before this is over. The person defending the theory was also the person who produced the measurements that made the theory testable, and the measurements did not go her way. Reich measured the drawings. What nobody had yet measured was the ground between them. Number 3. The boots. In the 1980s, the astronomer Anthony Aveni and the anthropologist Gary Urton did something that sounds too simple to count as a method. They walked, not to the famous figures along the lines, all of the ones they could reach, on foot across the pampa, recording where each one began, where it ended, and what it touched. The results were published in 1990 in a volume Aveni edited for the American Philosophical Society called The Lines of Nazca. What the walking produced was a shape nobody had ever seen from the air, for the simple reason that from the air we see figures, and from the ground we see junctions. Aveni and Urton identified at least 62 ray centers, points where straight lines converge in a spoke pattern, and something on the order of 800 straight lines running between them. And the ray centers are not randomly placed. They sit on high ground, overwhelmingly near the places where water comes down out of the highlands and enters the valley. Trapezoids cluster around them, and more often than not those trapezoids run parallel to the direction the surface water flows. Johann Reinhard had argued along adjacent lines in 1987, tying the geoglyphs to mountain deities, to water, and to fertility. Helene Silverman, writing in the journal World Archaeology in 1994, identified the vast adobe site of Cahuachi, the largest ceremonial complex the Nazca ever built, sitting across the river from the Pampa, as a pilgrimage center, with lines associated with the routes people took to reach it and to leave it. Later survey work sharpened that into something almost architectural. The network of straight lines and trapezoids has entrances at the northern end. In the Ingenio Valley, there are around 10 narrow ways in. At the southern end, in the Nazca Valley, there are only 2 wide ones. One of them opens directly opposite Cahuachi. The other sits where 2 rivers meet to form the Nazca, the kind of place the Quechua word tinki describes, where 2 opposing forces converge and the ground becomes charged because of it. 10 small doors at one end, 2 great doors at the other, both opening onto somewhere that mattered. Put together, the walking changed the grammar of the question. A line drawn on a calendar is a mark. A line you walk is a route. We are not looking at a diagram of the sky, we are looking at a floor. And the crack in this one is that association is not intention. A ray center standing where water enters a valley is a strong pattern. It is not a sentence anybody wrote down. Aveni's own volume lays out at least 5 competing hypotheses for why the geoglyphs exist and does not pretend to close the question. The version that reads the animal figures as constellations has taken the hardest hit because those constellations are not attested in any indigenous account, which means the sky being read into that desert is largely a European sky, arriving about 1,500 years late. By the time archaeologists were walking the Pampa, the most widely read explanation of it anywhere on Earth had been written by a man who had never walked any of it. Number 2, the Styx and the Cord Erich von Daniken published Chariots of the Gods in the late 1960s, and the English edition landed in 1970. His reading of Nazca was that the lines had been built according to instructions from an aircraft, that the figures were signals, and that the longest and widest of the straight markings were landing strips. It became and remains the single most repeated thing anyone says about this desert. We are obliged to take it seriously enough to answer it properly, so we will. There are 3 reasons it does not survive contact with the ground. The first is the ground. Maria Reiche, asked about the runway idea by the journalist Loren McIntyre for National Geographic in 1975, pointed out that the supposed runways have had their stones cleared away, and that what lies underneath is soft. Her answer, quoted in the piece, "The spaceman would have gotten stuck." The second is the photograph. One of the images von Daniken published, a configuration he described as strongly reminiscent of aircraft parking areas at a modern airport, is a cropped picture of the knee joint of one of the bird figures. The third is that the joke has a known author. Paul Kosok, the man who started the entire field, wrote in 1947 that when the lines were first seen from the air, they were nicknamed prehistoric landing fields and compared jokingly to the so-called canals on Mars. It did not begin as a theory, it began as an aside in a paper by the first person to look. But the strongest answer to von Daniken is not an argument at all. It is an afternoon in Kentucky. On the 7th of August, 1982, Joe Nickel, then teaching technical writing at the University of Kentucky, assembled 5 relatives at a landfill outside the town of West Liberty. 2 cousins, a younger cousin, an 11-year-old nephew and his father running logistics. They intended to reproduce, at full size, the 440-foot condor from the Nazca Pampa. Their equipment was a centerline. Ropes painted off in Nazca feet of about 12.5 inches, wooden stakes, twine, and a T made of 2 thin strips of wood to keep each measurement square. That is the whole toolkit. No surveying instruments, no angles, no grid. The method was plotting coordinates. Measure along the center line of the small drawing to the point opposite a wingtip. Measure out to the wingtip. Repeat at scale on the ground. 9 hours later, they had staked 165 points and joined them with string. Once the rain stopped, they marked the outline in lime, and a local pilot took them up with a camera. Nickel's assessment, published in the Skeptical Inquirer in the spring of 1983, is that it came out accurate enough that they could easily have made it more symmetrical than the original. 6 people, sticks and string one afternoon. Then he ran a control, which is the part almost nobody quotes. His father brought a wildlife biologist named Harold Barber out to the field without telling him what the project was, or that Peru had anything to do with it. Standing on the ground beside it, Barber identified the figure as a bird, shown photographs of several Nazca birds afterwards. He picked out the condor. Nickel is careful about what this proves, and we should be equally careful. He doubts the Nazca ever laid out a mile of string the way his crew did, and suspects they plotted far fewer points and worked much more of it freehand, which would explain the asymmetries in the real condor that his copy did not have. The experiment shows the method was available with the materials on hand. It does not show that this was the method, he says so himself, in the paper. But Barber is the finding that matters for where we are going. It is constantly asserted that these drawings can only be recognized from the air. A stranger identified one from ground level, and some of the older ground drawings in Peru are not on the flat pampa at all. They sit on hill slopes, angled toward people standing on their own 2 feet, which brings us to 2020, when no algorithm was involved whatsoever. A work crew was improving a tourist viewing platform on a hill above the pampa, a hill visitors had been climbing for years in order to look at the famous figures somewhere else. On the slope underneath them, someone noticed faint grooves. Peru's Ministry of Culture announced it that October, a cat, about 37 meters from nose to tail, its outline badly degraded by erosion, by rockfall, and by human feet. Johnny Isla, the ministry's specialist for the Nazca region, put it at roughly 2,000 years old, late Paracas, older than most of the celebrated figures out on the flat. For years, people had stood on it to look at something else. You can stand on a thing your whole life and still need to be told it is there. That is the entire problem of this desert compressed into one hillside, and it is exactly the problem somebody finally decided to attack at scale. Number 1. The probability map the team was led by Masato Sakai of Yamagata University, working with Akihisa Sakurai and Siyuan Liu, with Jorge Olano of the Université Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne, with Konrad Albrecht of the German Aerospace Center, and with Hendrik Hammann and Marcus Freitag of the IBM Thomas J. Watson Research Center. Their results appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on the 23rd of September, 2024. The problem they set themselves was not the famous figures. It was the other kind, those small relief geoglyphs, the 73 nobody paid attention to in the 1940s. Grown slowly by then to about 380 known examples. Everything about them is hard. They average 9 meters across, against 90 for the line-type figures. They sit on slopes instead of flat ground, and they have been out in the weather for 2 millennia. And the search area is 629 square kilometers of desert that, until this point, had to be inspected by experts staring at photographs with the naked eye. We can measure how badly that scales. Through the middle of the 20th century, new figurative geoglyphs were turning up at about 1.5 a year. Then high-resolution satellite imagery arrived, and by 2020 the whole pampa had been photographed from aircraft at 10 centimeters per pixel. The rate went up roughly 12-fold. It was still under 20 a year. The model they built had one serious handicap: not enough to learn from. Networks like this normally train on tens of thousands of examples per category, and the entire known population of relief geoglyphs was a few hundred outlines. So they made two choices. They started from a model already trained on ordinary photographs and fine-tuned it, rather than building one from nothing. And instead of asking it to draw a box around a figure, they had it output a continuous probability map across the desert, which meant every known geoglyph could be chopped into many small crops and shown to the model over and over. Then came the part nobody puts in the headline. The model's output was not a list of discoveries. It was tens of thousands of maybes, and every one of them had to be looked at by a person. Roughly 47,000 candidate boxes went under human eyes. About 1,300 survived as high potential and were sorted into 3 ranks by how convincing they looked. On average, the archaeologists worked through 36 machine suggestions to arrive at a single promising one, and then they walked. From September 2022 to February 2023, under permit from the Peruvian Ministry of Culture, the team went out on foot and reached 341 of those sites, ground truthing. The same instrument Avini used, the same instrument Mejia Cespe used 100 years earlier. Between the screening and the walking, the survey cost close to 2,500 hours of human labor, and the machine's real contribution was deciding where those hours got spent. They confirmed 303 new figurative geoglyphs. The known count went from 380 to 683. In a single field season, the discovery rate rose about 16-fold over the aerial photography era, which had itself been about 12 times faster than everything before it. Nearly double one season. But the count is not the finding. The finding is what became visible once the sample was finally large enough to say anything at all, and it quietly inverts what the aeroplane taught us. With the new figures included, the two kinds of drawings separate cleanly. There are 50 line-type figures averaging 90 meters, and roughly 2/3 of them depict wild animals: the monkey, the spider, the hummingbird, the killer whale. Every one of the famous ones. There are 683 relief figures averaging 9 meters, and 81.6% of them depict human beings or things human beings made. About 1/3 are human figures. About 1/3 are severed heads. Roughly, 1 in 7 is a domesticated llama or alpaca. Wild animals, the entire subject matter of the famous ones, account for under 7%. Then the positions, which is where it stops being a catalog and starts being a claim. The relief figures sit an average of 43 meters from the winding informal trails that crisscross the pampa. Paths with no plan and no clear beginning or end, worn into the desert by people walking the same way over and over. The line-type figures sit an average of 34 meters from the formal network of straight lines and trapezoids, the ceremonial architecture running toward Cahuachi. So there are two populations here, and they were never doing the same job. The giant animals belong to the community's ritual network, beside ground laid out on a plan, plausibly walked in procession. The small ones are roadside. They sit within sight of a footpath. They show people and livestock and violence done to people, and they were made and looked at by individuals or small groups going past on ordinary business, not signals sent upward signs beside a road. Now the honesty, and this entry requires a great deal of it. The machine missed things. Of the 303 new figures, the model flagged fewer than 200 on its own. The rest were not individually predicted at all. Some turned up only because the model had spotted a neighbor in the same cluster and sent people to the right hillside, and around 60 were found by human beings on the ground with no machine involvement whatsoever. Relief geoglyphs come in scenes, a group of figures or a group of heads, and the model had a habit of catching one member of a scene and missing the others. The survey is also unfinished by a wide margin. Nearly 1,000 promising candidates were never visited at all, applying the success rates from the ranks they did reach. The authors estimate at least 248 more will turn out to be genuine. Their own paper says the number is provisional. The dating is by association, not by the figures. Pottery scattered on and around the geoglyphs places the use of the pampa from at least the 1st century before the Common Era, through to the 15th century after it. The relief figures are assigned to the earliest Nazca phase, or before it on the basis of style and manufacturing technique. Nobody has directly dated a furrow, and distance is not intent. 43 meters from a trail is a real, measurable, repeated pattern across hundreds of cases. It is not a statement of purpose, and the authors do not claim that it is. Their conclusion is worded as an inference, and they add in plain language that it does not rule out the geoglyphs having also worked at some other level entirely. What we are left with is not a solved desert. It is a better read one. Count the instruments from an aeroplane. The pampa looked like a calendar. Under a tape measure, it looked like geometry. On foot, it looked like a network of routes with sticks and string in a Kentucky landfill. It looked like an afternoon's work for a family of 6. Under a probability map, it looks like something quieter and much stranger, hundreds of small pictures of people standing beside the paths that people actually walked. 5 instruments, 5 different deserts, and the desert itself never changed once. That is the thing worth carrying out of this. Nazca is the cleanest case we have of a record that lost nothing. No fire took it, no conquest buried it, no library burned. Every figure ever cut into that ground was still lying there in the open, in full daylight, for anyone standing in the right place, including 303, that a century of trained archaeologists walked past, and one that tourists stood on top of in order to photograph something else. Which means the limit on what we knew about these people was never preservation. It was reading, and that should sit uncomfortably because a lost thing and an unread thing look exactly the same from the outside. We cannot tell them apart by looking. The only way to find out which one we are holding is to acquire an instrument we do not currently possess, turn it on ground we have already searched, and measure what we missed. At Nazca, we now know that number at least once. It was about half. By the team's own arithmetic, there are at least 248 more still out there, lying face up in a desert that has never once, in 2,000 years, tried to hide anything from anyone. If you want to see more of what the record keeps hidden, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.